Okay, we've heard a lot today about how eclectic medicine was started and developed, how a lot of these eclectic principles and practices and preparations have been used in naturopathic clinical practice in the past and are currently still employed. And so I would like to talk a little bit about the marriage between eclectic medicine and early naturopathy, and how that bore a child called naturopathic medicine. And might sound a bit strange, but there are very distinctive and really dramatic differences between eclectic medicine and naturopathy. They were, in fact, highly antagonistic at one point, but like any marriage, you know that the strength of a marriage is in the differences, in the complementarity of the two different ways of approaching and looking at life. And when you marry them together with love and compassion and appreciation for the other person's differences, you can really grow yourself and become a better person. And it's a struggle, okay? So we had this struggle, this tension that has existed between natural medicine and eclectic medicine in terms of the use of medications. So I'd like to go back really to the era of pre-naturopathy. We know that the term naturopathy was purchased by Benedict Lust in the late 1890s from a homeopath who had developed the term. So there were antecedents to naturopathy that were part of the alternative medical practices in America beginning about the same time that eclectic medicine or American reform medicine began arising, which was in the 1830s. So we had especially, and it was really great that Dr. Moore could discuss hydrotherapy, because hydropathy was really the beginning of the major alternative medicine approach in the United States. And there were many advocates and practitioners, among them James K. Jackson, Joel Shue, R.T. Trawl, a lot of various other people who were practicing largely in the New York area, the New York State, because of the abundance there of the mineral springs. And it's interesting that most of these people, in particular Jackson, were advocates of vegetarianism. It was a time in the nation of a lot of transition and reform. In particular, it was manifestations of what was known as Jacksonian democracy, in which basically we were a frontier society and people relied upon their own resources and their own abilities and skills, and were very adaptable to situations, but basically tried to provide all essential functions and services for themselves simply because they weren't available on the frontier or in small towns. If you weren't in the big city, you were pretty much likely your own doctor. So there was that led to the growth of Thomsonian herbalism, in which each person was their own doctor. In most cases, mothers and grandmothers were doctors to their children and families. And so part of that movement was the hydropathy movement, in which they utilized water as a really potent therapeutic device that was popularized in Europe through Preissnitz, and was, there's a lot of experimentation going on. But in regards to the American scene, they were generally associated with particular mineral springs, and it had to do not only with treatment with water, but the advocation of other things, like I said, vegetarianism and whole grains. This Trawl, he developed the first whole grain cereal, which he called granula. And they started a lot of journals in which they shared their ideas about health. The Water Cure Journal began in 1846, which was renamed the Herald of Health by Trawl in 1863, and we will see a revisitation of that name of that journal, Herald of Health, with Benedict Lust, when he started publishing his first journal in English. It was called the Herald of Health and the Naturopath, and which became Naturopath and the Herald of Health, as he changed his point of emphasis. but you could see right there this connecting link. So a lot of these people, because they practiced other approaches besides strictly hydrotherapy, using both water, nursing, simple vegetarian foods, fresh air and exercise, and cheerful social surroundings. They largely were based around the sanitarium experience, in which a person would be removed from their normal everyday environment to a place where they could rest and relax and heal. And so part of the process was not only treatment while they were there, but learning a new mode of life, of making a transition, having a transformative experience rather than simply receiving therapy for their ills. So what it was really focused on was teaching people how to live. It was looking at their long-term health rather than their short-term ills. And as Dr. Rubin emphasized, that is really the strength of naturopathic medicine. We're healthcare providers rather than people who manage disease symptoms. And so probably the best known of all of these then would be a student of Trall's. He passed away in 1877, but by then another man had stepped forth, John Harvey Kellogg, who became famous through his sanitarium at Battle Creek, the first one which burned down. I don't know if all of you have seen Road to Wellville. If you haven't, you need to look at that to get a little idea of the context of the real social setting of a lot of these hydrotherapy sanitariums in those days. There was a lot of experimentation going on and a lot of advocacy of health practices that we still employ today, particularly good quality whole food diets, and in particular teaching people right lifestyles. And of course, in the context of 19th century lifestyles, that implied a lot of differences than what our concerns are today, but I think being expressed in terms of drawing closer to nature and whole foods and avoiding toxins. This was a process where they were all strong advocates against opiates, which were commonly available and employed, alcohol, tobacco, and often stimulating spices. Now, I thought that was interesting and peculiar, since spices are some of the most potent and valuable antioxidant substances that I personally use and that are, growing in popular acclaim today. And I got to thinking about it, and a lot of this kind of social experimentation, a lot of the alternative practitioners seem to be in one of two camps. They were either very prudish or libertine. There were several practitioners, I believe it was William Alcott and his wife, not certain about that, who practiced a lot of advocacy of knowing your body and being comfortable with your body. But for the most part, I think there's a lot of suppression of sexual expression, and so the idea of removing stimulants from your system and things that might irritate mucosal tracts and enhance arousal were something to be avoided in their terms, and sex as infrequently as possible was standard for some of these people, including John Harvey Kellogg. They felt that there was a diminishment of the vital force. But in addition to that, those groups of people, which basically were known by the umbrella term of hygienists, which combined right living with hydrotherapy, concurrent with the eclectics was a professional group of herbalists known as the physiomedicalists. The term physiomedicalism means nature's medicines, and they were a professional offshoot of the Thomsonian lay herbalists, and their whole point was to avoid any medication that had a toxic potential. So while in common with the eclectics, they utilized herbs and herbal extracts as their primary medications, they avoided those herbs that the eclectics used quite frequently and comfortably in small doses because they were toxic. For the same reason, they had a running battle with the homeopaths, who used extremely toxic things in non-material doses, but that still was too much for them. The concept of a toxin in their minds was at a cellular level, and that there was no safe dose. As naturopathic physicians, I think we would all argue with that, but these different and a competing and opposing approaches to practice in those days were quite antagonistic with one another. You became a member of a certain camp, and you defended your camp against the other intruding forces. And so you had the regular conventional doctors and then the irregulars, which included the eclectics, who would use anything, the physiomedicalists, who were herbal purists, more or less, and then the hygienists, who didn't rely on any medication. And so that kind of set the stage in the late 19th century for the arrival of Benedict Lust from Germany as a young man who, when he arrived in New York, became very sickly and discovered he was suffering from tuberculosis, very common in those days. So he returned to his native Germany and approached, there was probably one of the most famous and popular practitioners in Europe, if not the world at that time, was a German Bavarian priest by the name of Father Sebastian Kneipp, or Knipe. I'm never clear as to what the actual pronunciation is, whether we have that silent K or not. We'll say Knipe. Because Lust himself was Catholic, and it was a great appeal to approach a priest who had empirically treated many, many people successfully with cold water therapies and this very simple philosophy of life which could be applied to the German and European peasantry because it was free, essentially. Cold water, herbs that grow in the meadow, simple diet. It was an approach that wasn't just for the people who could afford the optimal medical care. It was for anybody who was open to God's gifts. Because, the Catholic perspective of nature is that it's incarnational, that God works in and through nature. And if you're a believer, you believe that what we are surrounded by in the natural world are all gifts to serve our interests and to help and support us to grow and be healthy and the most complete people we can be if used rightly. So Lust was treated by Father Knipe. He was cured of tuberculosis, which is no mean feat, and he was so enthusiastic that Father Knipe sent him back to America as his advocate and commissioner to carry these healing methods to the New World, because there was a large and growing German community, especially in New York City, where Lust landed. So an interesting thing, an aspect about Father Knipe's approach to treating with water was that he said it was a very powerful therapy, but he really believed that the combination of herbs with water greatly enhanced the power of the water therapy. And it's interesting that the herbs he used were few and common, and the forms that they used were those forms that are used traditionally throughout the world. In his book, My Water Cure, Knipe listed a total of 51 herbs, a very small armamentarium when you concern yourself with herbal medicine. 43 of the 51 were used as teas. They were, some of them used in a variety of forms, so we'll add all these up to, it'll be more than 51, but 43 of the 51 were taken as teas, 13 as dried powders, 9 as fresh herbs, 9 as tinctures, 5 as oils, and 5 as volatile oils. So when Lust brought that system of medicine, first started publishing the hydrotherapy and Knipe journals in the New World in German, he started also incorporating new remedies because he didn't want to limit himself to old world therapies in the New World. And so in his publication, the Herald of Health and Nature Path, there were a larger number of herbs, 128, which he ultimately advocated. They're all printed up in this little compendium of Benedict Lust's Materia Medica. And again, it's interesting to look at the types of preparations that he advocated. Out of the 128, 89 were water extracts, 19 were fresh herbs, 11 dried powders, 10 tinctures, 9 juices, 8 oils, 5 wine extracts, 3 beer extracts, 2 vinegar extracts, and 1 ash. So you see that he expanded the Materia Medica as part of his approach to combining the herbs with the hydrotherapy when he first started advocating naturopathy in the New World, but that he basically stuck with the simple, traditional folk forms of preparations. And why is that? If you can recall all the way back to this morning when I was talking about the development in the United States pharmacopoeia of herbal preparations and what were official, therefore legal drugs, therefore expected to be prescribed by physicians, it started out with teas, whole herbs, and tinctures. But those were reduced over the 19th century so that by the end of the 19th century there were only a couple of water extracts and dry herbs that were in use. It was mostly fluid extracts, tinctures, and solid extracts, more concentrated remedies. So in the mind of people who considered themselves drugless practitioners, people who used hydrotherapy and diet and natural living, sun, air, exercise, all these things that promote health, to use a tincture of fluid extract was considered drug therapy. In fact, Flexner, in his report in 1910, he described the eclectics, because of their heavy reliance on these specific medicines or fluid extracts, these concentrated botanical extracts, he called them drug mad. They were treating every patient they saw with some sort of medicinal botanical extract. And the naturopaths limited themselves to teas and dried herbs largely. And Lust explained that in the Naturopath and Herald of Health in one of his editorials. He said, people claim that we shouldn't be using these herbs because that's the same thing that these medical doctors, the eclectics and the regular doctors, they all use these herbal extracts. He says, no, they're using fractions, concentrated fractions of these herbal plants. We use teas, which are largely water, and whole herbs, which are vegetables. They would prescribe spoonfuls of dried powdered herbs to be stirred into water and consumed into warm water and taken whole. Does it remind anybody here of anything? Powders? And the concept of teas, when John Uri Lloyd, the eclectic pharmacist, he used to deride people who relied on teas, saying, well, if you want some weak medicine that's mostly water, yeah, go ahead and drink teas. Well, that's exactly what natural healers and naturopaths wanted, was some mild beverage that provided a lot of rehydration, nourishment. Water was seen internally to be a solvent, to be very important for elimination, both through the kidneys and the bowels and the skin. And so to consume these herbal teas that were mostly water was the most appropriate form in their minds because it helped to dissolve all of the toxins that had accumulated. It was believed that these things had formed some sort of precipitation, or at least were stored in various tissues, fat, and other organs of the body. And so to eliminate them effectively, they needed to be flushed out, and herbs were part of that cleansing process that enhanced the solvent effect of the water and allowed for greater elimination of toxins. So that's why herbs were such an important part of naturopathy, even though it declared itself to be a drugless profession. And why did it declare itself to be a drugless profession? Because they were not medical doctors. These other professions I was talking about, the hydropaths, the physiomedicalists, and certainly the eclectics, were all graduates of medical colleges and had the title of MD. Naturopaths in the early 20th century went to prison and jailed consistently and frequently for being accused of practicing medicine without a license because they were not medical doctors. They distinctively were different. In those days, osteopaths were also considered drugless practitioners, and so it's not surprising. Lust, he received a degree in osteopathy in 1898. He actually received a homeopathic MD degree in 1902, and he graduated from the last class of the Eclectic College of New York in 1913 as an MD. So he had a DO and 2 MD degrees, but those degrees didn't qualify him for state licensure at that time because they didn't recognize those schools as being adequate to sit for the licensing exam. So while he was trying to cover his tracks and other naturopaths were performing various other stunts to stay out of jail, for the most part, they had to be very careful that they were not using drugs. And drugs in those days, official drugs in the United States Pharmacopoeia and National Formulary, included most tinctures and fluid extracts, things that we would, things that are sold today as dietary supplements. Changes of definitions bring about interesting comparisons. So at any rate, simultaneous with the appearance of naturopathy was basically the demise of physiomedical practice. Again, these were the herbalists who not only didn't use potentially toxic botanicals, they opposed things that the eclectics would use, such as aconite, gelsemium, bryonia, veratrum, henbane, belladonna, all these sorts of drug herbs that were in the United States Pharmacopoeia were eschewed by the physiomedicalists. But they had a more sophisticated methodology. For the most part, the herbal teas and dried herb approach of Knipe and early naturopathy was the use of simples. They would use generally a single herb, which, as we've discussed, is a complex pharmaceutical formula in and of itself. But the physiomedicalists had a much more sophisticated and refined means of prescribing, which involved individual formulation of remedies, assessing each person's function, seeing what organs and organ systems needed to be enhanced and supported, and others that may need to be somehow inhibited or suppressed to a degree with the different medications, different herbs that would be blended together in a complementary formula that was specific for that patient and then adjusted as the patient began to transform health-wise. So what you had, and that was one of the reasons I mentioned that these liquid medications were so popular among the professional medical doctors who utilized herbs, was that it was very easy to formulate a botanical composition or combination within a bottle using liquids, as opposed to, say, with Chinese medicine, when they write an individual prescription and have to combine all the different dried herbs into separate packages to cook up as a soup that you are going to consume one of those each day. It was a matter of good old American ingenuity and convenience that they just poured it all into one bottle and dispensed a week's supply in a 4-ounce bottle that you take 1 teaspoon 3 times a day. It greatly simplified things for the doctor and the patient. So we have then naturopathy kind of running up against eclectic medicine. The eclectics looked down their noses at these drugless healers, called them therapeutic nihilists, because they didn't prescribe strong concentrated botanical extracts, while the naturopaths kind of looked at the eclectics as being people who really weren't addressing the underlying health issues which were causing people to get sick. And so how did they ever get together? What do they have in common? Well, I'd say the first and foremost agreement between eclectics and naturopaths was the holistic principle that was also shared by homeopaths and physiomedicalists, that you treat the patient, not the disease. That every individual who comes into an office for treatment deserves attention that's specific to their own individual manifestation of health and disease. I'd say that's probably the biggest common denominator of all these alternative practices compared with conventional medicine, which tended to treat the name of the disease, and if the patient could survive that same treatment that was given to everyone with the same named condition, then good for them. If not, then, that's unfortunate. The other thing about naturopathy, a lot of the focus of therapy was, again, it went back to hygienists. Many of the very successful naturopaths, including Lust, had sanitariums. For Lust, it was Youngborn. He had one in New Jersey, which was a few hours ride out of New York City by train, and then in the winter, one in Florida. But many of the naturopaths would associate themselves with mineral springs or some kind of sanitarium where a person could go receive instruction in living and get practical practice of how to live, to get out in nature every morning, maybe walk barefoot through the morning dew, and certainly exercise, breathe, be served good, whole, nourishing food that was fresh, and basically be trained in how to take these whole holistic health practices back home with them. And so it was a transitional and transformational experience that really addressed long-term health issues in terms of prevention of chronic disease and building health so that you would experience less and less acute disease as well. Whereas the focus of a lot of the medical practice in all these drug prescriptions was addressing acute illness, saving people from death from serious acute illness, and therefore neglecting the underlying problems and processes that led to them becoming acutely ill. As a consequence, these eclectics, they were all mavericks within their own right. So even within the profession, they had a lot of conflict and disagreement sometimes, as Dr. Haller pointed out, between the homeopaths and the more broad-minded eclectics in those days. And when Scudder was starting his whole specific medication in the early 1870s, there were a couple of graduates from the Eclectic Medical College in Cincinnati that decided to go different directions from the one in which he had designed for this new approach of specific medicine and specific diagnosis, specific medication. One of them being James Tyler Kent, which Dr. Haller mentioned last night. He was a graduate in 1873. And he went straight from practice into, there was a new medical school starting in St. Louis, Eclectic Medical College, called the American Medical College. And he became an instructor there in anatomy while practicing his profession, and was newly married and was setting up shop and thought he was doing quite well, but his first wife got sick and died. And he was unable to save her. He continued to teach there to school and practice, and remarried. And his second wife became seriously ill. He was consulting all the best doctors he could find and found that he was unable to find any help within his own eclectic camp. So he stepped outside and asked for a consultation from a homeopath who treated his wife, and she recovered dramatically, and he converted immediately. Became a diehard homeopath to the extent that his books are probably some of the most valued writings on the subject of homeopathic medicine today. He's best known for his repertory, but since I was packing all of these little samples of books to show in my briefcase, I didn't want to bring the Bible of Kent's Materia Medica or his repertory. So a little text he wrote when he was instructing at various colleges on lectures on homeopathic philosophy is just a reminder for me to give James Tyler Kent his due as a very open-minded eclectic who was willing to try something different, but then kind of went what I would consider overboard in specializing to the exclusion of other approaches. His full right and privilege as an American, where we enjoy much freedom in this country, but at the same time, a bit of an overreaction from my perspective. Now, there was another gentleman who graduated a year before Kent at the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati by the name of J.H. Tilden. His father had been a medical doctor. He preceptored with his father, and then as a young man attended medical school in Cincinnati, graduated, and went back to practice in his hometown in southern Illinois, across the river from the big river from St. Louis. So when Kent left his position as anatomy professor at the American School of Eclectic Medicine in St. Louis, Tilden stepped in. He'd been a graduate student at that school, and so he became its anatomy instructor. And he practiced there for a number of years before moving on to Wichita, Kansas, where he again set up a clinic, and then finally transferred to Denver, Colorado, where he ran a sanitarium beginning around 1900 until he died about 1935 or 39, late 30s. What's interesting about Tilden was that his experience in going back into medical practice in a small rural Illinois town and also in Wichita, Kansas, was that he was treating people successfully. They were coming in with serious illness and conditions. He was using specific medication. They were getting better, and then he would see them a few months, year later, whatever. They had some other condition. He would treat them. They'd get well temporarily. They'd be back. he noticed these people weren't ever getting well. They were just recovering from acute expressions of their underlying ill health. And this struck him as inadequate from his perspective of what he wanted to do for them as a doctor. And so he developed various theories as to what caused people to get ill, ultimately advocating for the idea of toxemia as being the underlying cause of all illness. Toxemia being a result of either endotoxemia, of creating toxins in your own body from poor health practices, or being exposed to environmental toxins, which were to a large extent medications, things that were used to treat people in their illness. So he became one of these therapeutic nihilists, where he stopped treating people with drugs and began relying on natural home methods, using simple hydrotherapy techniques, but largely using a vegetarian diet and vegetables to treat people under ill health. And he says, basically, here's the deal. If you stop poisoning people, they're going to get better. And if you support their system in the process while they're detoxifying with good nourishing foods, fruits and vegetables, which are high in all kinds of nutritive substances that they hadn't identified at the time, but we have later known to label with various identities as vitamins, minerals, and polyphenolic compounds, including flavonoids and anthocyanins and so forth, that all of these things, carotenes, the things that give food their color and flavor, are the things that are going to cure you. And in addition to that, if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, you're getting a lot of what Ed loves to call new water that's manufactured in the plant, by the plant, for the plant, and will certainly nourish anyone who eats the plant. And then fiber, which of course binds these toxins in the gut and helps their elimination, keeps people regular, and is a wonderful way of nourishing people. So these two gentlemen, these two graduates of Eclectic Medical College, who seem to have abandoned their eclectic heritage, ended up with therapeutic approaches which were later adopted by another of our naturopathic fathers, a man by the name of Henry Lindlar, who, like Lust, was a German immigrant. Only he moved to Texas, turned out to be very successful as a real estate magnate there, and ultimately moved to Montana. In those days, success was basically expressed by your ability to eat yourself to death. He became very obese and diabetic and was told that he was going to die and just to go home and let go of life because it was letting go of him. Well, Henry Lindlar was a strong-willed, strong-headed man. He thought, well, if this doctor tells me I'm going to die, I'm going to prove him wrong. So he went back to Germany. He went to visit Father Knipe, received hydrotherapy. Now, before the hydrotherapy treatment, Father Knipe would have a personal interview with all these patients. And so it says that Lindlar came down, sat down in front of him. He was a big, obese man, diabetic. And they said, Father Knipe looked at him and says, "You're a pig. Stop eating meat. No potatoes, no grains. Get out of here." And so within a matter of a few weeks, his diabetes was under control. He started losing weight. He became a health enthusiast. So he started traveling around to all these other sanitariums and natural healers in Europe to learn other techniques that he could bring back to the New World. Moved to Chicago, it was a medical license, and that was John Holler was telling me what there were 87 medical schools in Chicago. Take your pick. You could pick up a medical license pretty quickly, but while he was still in medical school, he obtained a drugless healing license, which was available there at that time based upon his experience in Europe. And then as soon as he had his medical degree, he opened a school and a sanitarium, School of Natural Health, and a sanitarium where he treated people with fresh air on the roof, sunshine, hydrotherapy, but primarily diet, nutrition, and he did incorporate some homeopathy. And it's interesting in his book on the philosophy of natural health that he used the same illustration pretty much that is found in this book on toxemia by Tilden, which was published in 1925. I think Lindlar's book predated that a bit, but it shows toxemia as being this trunk of the tree and all of the diseases at the top and all of the causes of toxemia at the bottom. And he's saying, if you cut off the roots, the medicine was cutting off the branches, right? They were cutting off the diseases and trying to stop them, but just new branches would grow off the trunk. So their argument is you cut the roots, you cut the sources of this toxemia off, and you cure disease and preserve health. So that's what Lindlar taught. And I'm not sure if he was like a 33rd degree Mason. I believe it was. There was some Masons and Catholics really didn't mix at all in those days. And so he wasn't, arm in arm with lust. He kind of developed a similar yet different approach, which he called natural therapeutics. He didn't use the term naturopathy. But the graduates of Lindlar School in Chicago joined the graduates of Lusk School, American School of Naturopathy in New York, to get many states licensed. They work together in developing different types of drugless healing, and very often, again, in association with mineral springs. In my own personal experience, I grew up outside of a little town called Cawker City, Kansas, which was 2 miles down the road from an ancient sacred mineral springs of natives who had come there. Even warring tribes, it was said, would never fight around the springs. It was considered so sacred. The Khan's Indian name for the springs was Wakanda, or as Black Elk used the term Wakanda. It's a designation for the Great Spirit. Was such an unusual manifestation in the middle of the plains, this cone that had been built up over millennia of the mineral residues, a 56-foot diameter pool at the top of this hill. And so the name of the river that flowed by was described by an Indian name that meant water on the hill, because this was an outstanding geological feature that even Zebulon Pike, on his way to Colorado to do his explorations in the early 19th century, took note of that at the division of the North and South Fork of the Solomon River in Kansas. So this was near my boyhood home. My father leased the ground around the springs, growing Native American grass seed, Indian grass, switchgrass, and our family doctor was an osteopath who was the third generation running this mineral springs. The first generation was a German nature curist who treated people with water. His daughter, his name was Carl Abrams. His daughter was a student at the Lindlar School in Chicago, and she married a man, Carl Bingesser, who had one of the first chiropractic degrees in the early 20th century. And so out of their marriage came their son, who was an osteopath and who also had a naturopathic license, who was our family physician. So I got to experience some of that old school sanitarium natural healing as a child when I was diagnosed with constipation, when I couldn't eat my meals at school because I was so anxious about being cooked by someone other than my mother. And he said, the boy's constipated. So I got the treatment, which involved internal baths and external packs, and with this high concentration of mineral spring water, which was really popular throughout that whole area, such that there were still Indians coming from Oklahoma, natives coming up from their reservations in the 1950s after they'd been driven there over 50 years prior and displaced, it was about 70 years prior, displaced from their homeland in northern Kansas. Some of the Potawatomis and Khan's Indians, Pawnees, were returning to the springs generations later to treat themselves with this water. So all this story coming to the point of, how did naturopathy, how did this drugless practice get together with eclectic medicine? Well, eclectic medicine died, as we heard a little bit about the demise of the college in Cincinnati, which was the last school after 1915 to exist, and with the death of John Murray Lloyd in 1935, it lost its financial support. Licensing laws were no longer really allowing eclectic medical doctors to be licensed and practice without, forging some sort of agreement that they would abandon the tenets of eclecticism if they were allowed to be licensed. And so with the loss of eclectic practice, you had certain naturopaths in the West who were very liberal in their thought. Naturopaths in the East tended to be the old school nature cure docs But in the West, we had people like Dr. William Turska, who had lived with and practiced with Swinburne Clymer, who was one of the last advocates of physiomedicalism. He graduated from the last physiomedical school in the United States, Indiana, and was set up practice in Pennsylvania, and wrote books such as Nature's Healing Agents, in which he ascribed the healing value of non-toxic herbs in a lot of these formulas to their mineral content. An interesting concept, which is not entirely untrue, but I don't think is the whole explanation either. Anyway, Dr. Turska felt that, well, this is great stuff, but it's really not getting people to full health. And he started reading the Materia Medica by Harvey Wicks Felter, published 1922, and Finley Ellingwood published his American Materia Medica Therapeutics and Pharmacognosy in 1919. He was discovered that, wow, these eclectics were using powerful medicines. And so he started experimenting with the physiomedicalist formulas in combination with the eclectic potent sedatives and stimulants and whatever was specifically indicated by the patient's presentation. He would use very minute fractional doses of these concentrated extracts in combination with the physiomedicalist formula as what he described as a synergist. So not only was the formula developed specifically for the patient, but the specific medication, which was a high potency concentrated remedy in very small doses, was given concurrently as a way to enhance the response to the formula. And he became a strong advocate of using medical resources such as the eclectic concentrated remedies, the specific medicines, in conjunction with naturopathic approaches. And so this was the marriage of naturopathy, which was a lifestyle approach using natural, holistic remedies to preserve and prolong vital health and prevent disease, along with remedies which could very effectively and powerfully treat acute illnesses as they occurred in the process of bringing people back to full health by their health practices and non-toxic herbal treatments. So this marriage of medicine and nature cure in the mind of people like Dr. Turska, and there were others who were in that same camp, Dr. John Bastyr, who you're all very familiar with. He was coming to the conclusions that all was not wrong with conventional medicine. It was just overused and abused. His own father was a pharmacist, while his mother was a Napian herbalist, and so he had both backgrounds in his practice and wasn't threatened by either one, and was very comfortable. His training himself was as a homeopath, so he incorporated all of these things: homeopathy, herbalism, and medicines where they were indicated and effective, such that after World War II, when antibiotics became the rage and really were replacing a lot of the traditional medicines in terms of people no longer seeing the value of holistic treatment, but were just looking for the quick fix and the miracle drug, right? That Bastyr wrote an article in a naturopathic journal saying, well, we have garlic, we've got Artemisia species, we have lomatium, which at the time was showing itself to be very powerful. And he says we have all of these very effective natural antibacterial remedies and other means to help people recover their full health without relying on antibiotics. But, he says, if these things are proving themselves to be inadequate, if the patient isn't responding or complying well enough with our regimen, where they're going to be able to enhance their own response effectively enough to overcome the infections, then the antibiotics are there if we need them. And that was utterly scandalous. Who would think that a drugless practitioner would come out and advocate for these miracle drugs, which were basically driving alternative practitioners, into oblivion because of the efficacy of the synthetic pharmaceuticals and other new drugs. Dr. Bastyr was never shy about admitting the need to give the patient what they needed, what was in their best interest, and to step over the pride that some practitioners have about being purists. I know that Dr. Turska had some choice words for for naturopaths who wouldn't employ, some powerful remedies. He talked a lot about the bucket and towel brigade, somewhat disparagingly describing people who relied exclusively on hydrotherapy and whole herbs or herbal teas. Well, at the same time, these doctors use those as well. The idea of eclecticism as applied to naturopathy manifested itself with the closure of the naturopathic program at Western States College here in Portland when it became Western States Chiropractic College in 1955, and they opened a new school for naturopaths, and there was a lot of argument about what this new school would be called. The people who had been graduates of Lindlar School in Chicago, which was the National College of Chiropractic with its naturopathic program, which had been very influential. His son Victor Lindlar in the 40s wrote a book entitled, a phrase you may be somewhat familiar with, "You are what you eat." He was describing the value of fruits and vegetables as a way to lose weight and to help to both enhance and protect yourself from disease as well as support normal system functions. And so that was a very strong element in the naturopathic community at the time. But Dr. Turska and others says, look, whatever we prescribe, whether it's water, whether it's an herb, it doesn't matter. Those are medicines. And we practice naturopathic medicine. We are at the same level as medical practitioners as anyone who wants to call themselves a medical doctor. And so therefore, this new school, we'll call it National College of Naturopathic Medicine. It's not naturopathy anymore. It's not natural therapeutics. We practice naturopathic medicine. We practice full scope medicine and rely on those things that are most helpful, most beneficial for the long-term health of the patient, but we'll utilize anything that's necessary if it involves, the necessary survival of the patient in the short term. So, out of the minds of people like Dr. Turska, Dr. Bastyr was born National College of Naturopathic Medicine. It influenced a whole new generation of naturopaths, some of which are seated in this room as I speak, and influenced the production of some other, manufacture of other botanical products. When we were students there was a group of recent graduates, Bruce Canvasser, Jerry Slusher, and the acupuncturist Kenny Rifkin, who started naturopathic formulations. And they had the novel idea that things they'd learned in school, like, if we combine vitamin C, which is good for the immune system, and zinc, which helps viral infections, and echinacea, we got a vitamin, we got a mineral, we got an herb, there's nothing like that out there. Why don't we produce some naturopathic formulas? And they were doing that for their own clinical practice, and other naturopaths heard about it, says, well, hey, why don't you make some of that for us? So they started a little company, and so echinacea vitamin C became a standby remedy at the clinic when we were students. And one day Ed and I and another well-beloved yet deceased member of our class, Dr. Stanley Byerly, who was preceptoring law with Dr. Turska, went out and paid a visit and said, we got this formula, it's echinacea vitamin C. He says, we can do better than this, can't we? And so Turska kind of opened up his mind and shared some ideas, and thus there and then was born Optibiotic. Ed and Eclectic manufacture another formula for polycystic ovarian disease, Turska's formula. He has a couple of Bastyr formula A and B from some of Dr. Bastyr's formula. So in addition to some of these traditional eclectic formulas that's made here at Eclectic, like neutralizing cordial, which Dr. Moore was talking about this morning, and some of the specific echinacea, specific Sinusifuga, the traditional eclectic remedies, some of the traditional naturopathic remedies from these men who, blazed new frontiers and really inspired others to do so. So, aside from naturopathic formulations, then when Ed got out of college, he always talked as a student about, how can we, improve these medicines. So one of the things was when he got out, we were using all these homeopathic mother tinctures because that was the only form of extraction that was available, which was good in that it was made from fresh plants, but it was very dilute. So Ed started manufacturing botanical extracts with some strength from fresh plants, along the eclectic tradition. But really his mainstay was trying to promote whole fresh herbs, which was the basis for naturopathic practice. The wholeness, the complexity, all the nutrients, all the vitamins, all the polyphenols, everything in that package of the whole herb. And how best to do that than to apply modern technology, freeze drying, to traditional whole herbal medicine as practiced by naturopaths in the early 19th century. So rather than using dried, air-dried, sun-dried, oven-dried herbs, fresh freeze-dried herbs, preserving all of the potency and freshness in a fresh plant, but giving it in a powder form that could be consumed in a capsule if you don't want to taste it, or stirred into water if you enjoy the flavor of these plants. So, what Eclectic Institute has done is really taken the best of both worlds in this marriage of eclectic medicine and naturopathy, and brought it, the level of naturopathic medical practice up a notch because of the quality of the medications that, as Dr. Rubin mentioned, allows practitioners who are out there in their clinics doing it to do it better. And so I think it's great to be associated with part of that process. And there were other companies, people. It was Glenn Madison up in Seattle who started making these solid extracts, and a lot of naturopaths were inspired by Dr. Turska, Dr. Bastyr to help transform naturopathic medicine of the late 20th century and bring it into the 21st century. I'd have to say, Dr. Michael Murray with his promotion of some of the European standardized concentrated extracts was part of that movement of emphasizing the importance of clinical published research and supporting what we do. So the lesson to be learned by all of this, I think you can go back to the eclectics who, in Cincinnati, specific medicines were the rage. That was, the school was there, the mother school, of which graduates went out and started other schools, just as graduates from National College started the other naturopathic schools in this country. You had eclectics in California who were using fluid extracts produced by Park Davis in Detroit, because Park Davis was doing research on Western medicinal plants, Cascara sagrada, Berberis aquifolium, the Oregon grape, Yerba mansa, all of these different West Coast herbs that they were producing high quality concentrated extracts that weren't the specific medicines. There's variability in styles of practice. You have greater choice, the more types of medicinal preparations that are available. You can choose, as eclectic means, egleko, to choose the best type of preparation of a particular plant or combination of plants, vitamins, minerals, or other elements to give to the patient who needs that type of preparation at that point in time to best serve their health needs. So that's where I think where naturopathy has fully embraced eclectic medicine and surpassed it, because we're no longer, I think, in this isolated camp where we have to defend our methodology in opposition to everyone else. We live under the big umbrella. We embrace different approaches. We appreciate all of the choices that we have available to us, and we make the best of those choices for the benefit of each individual patient as they come to doctors in their clinical practice for help. And so it's my pleasure to be associated with all of these people who are doing it out there in the field, and to support them in any way I can with what I can find out through reading, writing, thinking a little bit about it, and sharing these thoughts. So I appreciate you all hanging out through this warm afternoon and staying here to the end, and thank Stephen for not pulling the plug on me. Have a good afternoon. Oh, one last thing. There is a sample of the fifth issue of the first volume of the Eclectic Medical Journal reprints, which is available in this box up here, and please come and help yourself to a copy. Some of the topics pretty much cover every talk that was given here this weekend. I'm sorry there's not an article about Dr. Wheat, simply because I wasn't familiar with him at the end or couldn't find an article. This was all articles taken from the 1906 Eclectic Medical Journal. And in addition, I wrote a tribute to Dr. William Turska and Dr. John Bastyr, little short biographies of them. But it covers information about eclectic education and quotes a lot from Dr. John Haller in the first Periscope editorial that I wrote. There are advertisements for his books and articles on a number of food herbs that were used by the eclectics. Watermelon, parsley, cayenne pepper. So the eclectics we're not, didn't avoid those naturopathic remedies when they were appropriate either. So please help yourself to a free copy. I think you'll find that it will help you understand and appreciate a lot of what was said here a little better if you see the original articles written by eclectic medical doctors, and it helps put it all into better context. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis.